Welcome to another episode of The Monk and the Hedonist. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Stephen Gundry, who is one of the world's top cardiothoracic surgeons and a pioneer in nutrition. He's also medical director at the International Heart and Lung Institute and Center for Restorative Medicine. He has spent the last 2 decades studying the microbiome and now helps patients on a daily basis use diet and nutrition as a key form of treatment. He's also author of many New York Times best-selling books and most recently released his new highly anticipated book called Unlocking the Keto Code, which offers a new take on the keto diet that debunks common myths and shows readers how to reap the rewards of a keto diet with less restrictions. He is also founder of Gundry MD, a line of wellness products and supplements, and host of the Gundry podcast. Such a pleasure to have you here today, Dr. Gundry. We've been looking forward to this for so long.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So before we start, we got to do a cheers to our beverage. So I'm in the office today, and I'm just drinking some sparkling water that has a little bit of flavor here, black cherry flavor.
Yeah, Deepthi, I'm doing the same thing. I'm in my office as well, and I'm just having a black coffee. What about you, Dr. Gundry?
Well, I'm in my office and I'm having my giant cup of tea, which has got 4 different types of tea in it, and I have about 2 or 3 cups of this size per day. How's that?
Oh, that's great. What kind of tea do you drink normally?
So I've got green tea, I've got mint tea, I've got pu'er tea, I've got white willow bark tea, and let's see what else they put in there today. Another type of, I've got 2 kinds of pu'er tea, chocolate pu'er and regular pu'er.
That's interesting. I've never thought of combining teas together like that. Okay.
All the anti-inflammatories.
Oh,
Yeah.
Don't say anti-inflammatories. They're actually uncouplers, and hopefully we can get into
Yes,
that.
we'll talk about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. We're all in the monk category, but Dr. Gundry gets the gold star for the most creative drink today. So, so Dr. Gundry, you started out as a cardiothoracic surgeon and dedicated many years of your life just to be able to practice that. So I'm very interested in hearing a little bit more about your journey and pivoting into practicing medicine in a more integrative and functional way.
Yeah, my life changed greatly in 1995 when I was a professor and chairman of cardiothoracic surgery at Loma Linda University here in Southern California. When I was famous, among other things, for taking on cases that nobody else wanted to do. And there's a few of us in the United States. So I was introduced to a gentleman from Miami, Florida, who I call Big Ed in all my books. And Big Ed was 48 years old, had inoperable coronary artery disease. That literally means was so extensive that you couldn't put stents in him. You couldn't do a bypass because there wasn't any place to land. And Big Ed had been going around the country looking for idiots like me to take him on. And everywhere he went, he was turned down. And he spent about 6 months doing this. And after 6 months, he arrived in my office bearing his angiogram, his cardiac catheterization, from 6 months previous. And I looked at it and I said, I don't like to turn people down. I don't usually turn people down, but I agree with everybody else. There's nothing I'm going to do for you. And he says, yeah, that's what everybody said, but hey, I've been on a diet for the last 6 months, and I've lost 45 pounds. Now, this is a big guy when I met him, 265 pounds, Big Ed. And he says, I've gone to a health food store, and I've been taking a lot of supplements. And he literally brought in this large shopping bag full of supplements. And he said, maybe I did something in here. And I go, well, good for you for losing all that weight, but, that's not going to change anything in here. And I know what you did with all those supplements. You made expensive urine. And I firmly believe that, like most, traditionally trained physicians. And he said, well, what the heck? I've come all this way. Why don't we get a new angiogram? And, I'm stroking my professor beard and say, okay. So in 6 months' time, this guy had cleaned out 50% of the blockages in his heart. They're gone. Now, I had never seen anything like that. And I said, hey, wait a minute. What kind of diet have you been on? And he starts to explain what he was doing, and I said, wait a minute, time out. Back in the dark ages, when I was in college at Yale, we could design our own major and defend a thesis. And my thesis was you could take a great ape, manipulate its food supply, manipulate its environment, and prove that you would arrive at a human being. And I actually defended my thesis and got an honors and gave it to my parents and went off to become a famous heart surgeon. So as he starts telling me his diet, I said, well, wait a minute, that's my thesis. And that was poignant because at that time I was 70 pounds overweight despite running 30 miles a week, going to the gym 1 hour every day, eating a healthy, low-fat, primarily vegetarian diet. And, wondering why I was such a big fat guy. I was pre-diabetic, insulin resistant, had such bad arthritis in my knees that I wore braces. I did baby heart transplants with migraine headaches, and I had horrible cholesterol numbers that I was told was genetic because my father was the same way. And so then I said, let me look at those supplements. And I was famous for preserving hearts during heart surgery. I invented a catheter that most people still use to protect the heart that bears my name. And I was putting ingredients in the cardioplegia. And I was looking through his supplements, and a lot of these ingredients that I'm putting down the veins and arteries of the heart, he's swallowing. And it, quite frankly, never occurred to me to swallow these things. So, long story short, I called my parents, got my thesis, put myself on my program, and started taking a bunch of supplements. And I lost 50 pounds my first year, and subsequently another 20, and I've kept it off for 27 years now. So at Loma Linda, I decided, well, this is really working good. So I'm going to operate on people, and then I'm going to teach them this program. And then I won't have to re-operate it on them, which was incredibly common, still is. And I did this for about a year, and we saw all these changes. People's high blood pressure went away, their diabetes went away, their arthritis went away. And so one Friday, what my wife still calls Black Friday, I looked in the mirror before going to work, and I said, I really got this all wrong. I shouldn't operate on people and then teach them how to eat. I should teach them how to eat, and then I won't have to operate on them. And, as a career choice at the top of your game in heart surgery, that's really stupid. I mean, that's really stupid. But I'd seen, so many changes that I just couldn't believe could happen, that I actually resigned my position. And I set up a clinic here in Palm Springs, which is just down the road from Loma Linda. And I decided to be a researcher in this. So I asked patients, look, I want to tell you certain foods not to eat. I want to tell you certain foods to eat. I want to send you to Costco or Trader Joe's to get supplements. There wasn't an Amazon back then. And I want to draw blood work on you every 3 months that insurance or Medicare will pay for, and let's see what happens. And so actually to this day, that's what I've done. And lo and behold, I started publishing at the American Heart Association and the European Heart Association my findings, and these were reproducible. And so that resulted in my first book back in mid-2000s, Dr. Gundry's Diet Evolution. But subsequently, through the years, the monster bestseller was The Plant Paradox, which is now approaching its 5th anniversary, and so on. So and I can tell you a lot of lean times followed that decision. I guess I was naive. A academic heart surgeon makes a nice living. Not as much as a private practice heart surgeon, but a nice living. But teaching people how to eat does not pay the bills, I can assure you. And I was, taking insurance, Medicare, and I still do. So anyhow, my wife, bless her heart, said, "Hey, you believe in this? It's okay. Just keep at it." And I guess the rest is history. But it's a struggle.
That's a fascinating journey, Dr. Gundry. I would love to go a little bit more granular then when we're talking about how you came up with your hypothesis and the things you learned from your patients. So when you left your surgical practice and you began to see patients and do research, what did you start seeing? What did you start finding?
Well, so a lot of the principles were actually based on the ancient human diet, and humans didn't eat grains or beans until 10,000 years ago at the beginning of agriculture. And humans were actually rather tall creatures. Most humans were over 6 feet tall up to 10,000 years ago. And within 2,000 years, we shrunk about a foot after grains and beans were introduced to the diet. Fast forward, all of us are originally from Africa, Europe, or Asia, and none of us were exposed to North or South American plants until 500 years ago when Columbian trade started. And there's a lot of plants that are incredibly modern to all of our diets, including corn and tomatoes and potatoes and peppers, eggplant, quinoa. These are all modern foods that none of us encountered in 500 years, before 500 years. So my initial program was, okay, we're going to take away modern human foods, and by that I mean 10,000 years human foods, and let's go back to what we used to eat, and let's see what happens. So little did I know back then that what I was taking away from people were a majority of lectin-containing foods. And as I began to see changes in inflammation in people's blood work, as I began to see changes in hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol plummet, then I said, wow, there's something really important going on here, and let's keep fiddling. For instance, I published a paper years ago. There's a way of measuring stickiness on the inside of blood vessels called the plaque test. And a lot of my patients were positive for the plaque markers. And we asked them to go get grapeseed extract, a polyphenol, and pycnogenol, French maritime tree bark, a polyphenol, and fish oil. And we showed that when they had that combination, their plaque number became normal. And then some people would forget or they get tired of taking it. And the next thing we know, 3 months later, their plaque is now elevated. And then we'd reintroduce these supplements, and lo and behold, reproducibly, their plaque would go down. And so I'd go, gee, that's pretty interesting. These things don't make expensive urine. And, now let's figure out, the mechanism how these are working. And actually the new book, Unlocking the Keto Code, really is my deepest dive yet into the mechanisms that these healthy foods, that these healthy supplements actually do their benefit, the mechanism of action.
So when you talk about, and this is for the audience that maybe is just getting introduced to some of these concepts for the first time, when you talk about a lectin, can you explain what that is and what foods do we see that in?
Yeah, so believe it or not, plants do not like to be eaten. They have a life. They were here first. Unfortunately, they can't run, hide, or fight from predators, but they are chemists of incredible ability. So they use biologic and chemical warfare to dissuade their predator from eating them, or their babies, their seeds. And part of their defense system are a series of proteins that are called lectins. Lectins are sugar-seeking protein molecules, and they can bind to the sugar molecules that line our gut. They can bind to the sugar molecules that line our blood vessels. They can bind the sugar molecules that bind between nerve endings, and so on. Dr. Alessio Fasano, who's now at Harvard, was the first to show that gluten, which is a lectin, causes leaky gut by binding to the wall of the gut, releasing a compound called zonulin, which breaks the tight junctions that hold our gut cells together. And that causes leaky gut. It's not pseudoscience. And so that's part of the plant defense system. If you produce leaky gut, then the animal feels lousy. You get inflammation, as I've written about in past books. And an animal that doesn't feel well or is not thriving rapidly learns, every time I eat this particular plant or plant baby, I don't do well. I'm going to go eat something else. The plant wins, the animal wins, everybody's happy. And as all of us here know, humans are remarkably stupid. And so when we eat things that get our attention, we take Advil or Aleve, or we take Nexium or Prilosec and Tums, and we keep going on eating, thinking this is absolutely normal. And that's what I did. That's what most of my patients did. And lo and behold, when we take these foods away from people. So most of the grains contain lectins. Sorghum and millet do not contain lectins. The nightshade family, which are North and South American plants, like white potatoes, like not beans, but beans have lots of lectins as well. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, goji berries, believe it or not, are nightshades. The bean family have some of the richest, densest concentration of lectins. Corn contains lectins. Oats have a gluten-like molecule that cross-reacts with gluten. So if you're gluten sensitive, please don't have your oatmeal. We see this all the time. So those are brief examples.
So I'm actually very curious about the lectins, and Bobby and I come from an Indian background, and I think a lot of the foods that people tend to veer towards are heavy in lectins. So how do you help people who have lectin-heavy diets reconcile that?
That's a great question. And so we have an amazing defense system against plant lectins, and there's multiple parts of that defense system. We have acid in our stomach, and acid does break down proteins, and lectins are proteins. So acid is the first line of defense. The second line of defense is that we would normally have a very generous layer of mucus that lines our gut wall, and mucus is a mucopolysaccharide that also traps lectins. And we know that people who have a type of bacteria called Akkermansia mucinophila have much better health long-term than people who don't have that, because this particular bug eats mucus, but the more mucus it eats, the more mucus our gut wall produces. So it's actually an incredibly beneficial bug. Number three, our microbiome, which used to be incredibly diverse, 10,000 different species, we have a microbiome that actually thoroughly enjoys eating gluten. We have a microbiome that thoroughly enjoys eating other lectins. But as most of us in the West now know, our microbiome has been, decimated by all the antibiotics that we personally have taken, antibiotics that we personally dispense, the antibiotics that are fed to our animals that we eat, and for the last 40 years, we've been exposed to the antibiotic glyphosate. Monsanto actually patented glyphosate, Roundup, as an antibiotic, and because it actually kills bacteria by interfering with the shikimate pathway. And so literally our defense system has been decimated. And I think one of the reasons traditional cultures tolerate lectins so well is, number one, they've not been exposed to all this disruption of all this defense system. Number two, traditional cultures, for the most part, have figured out a way to lessen the lectin load. The Incas fermented quinoa and let it rot before they cooked it. And, in India, there's a long tradition of soaking lentils, soaking beans, multiple water changes. Interestingly enough, beans and lentils actually have bacteria on their surface, and the soaking actually produces fermentation. And the fermentation process also degrades lectins. So you look at how traditional cultures have figured this out, and even modern foods. The Italians did not eat tomatoes for 200 years after their native son brought them back because they were deadly. And even today, Italians always peel and deseed their tomatoes and peppers before they eat them. The Southwest American Indians, which lived on peppers, always charred, peeled their peppers, and deseeded them before they ate them. And corn, they always treated with lye, turning it into hominy to degrade the lectins in corn. Unfortunately, Columbus didn't learn that trick, and we've reaped the habit ever since from something as simple as corn.
That makes sense because we grew up with soaking lentils, but I don't think ever understood really why that was done. And so this is actually really fascinating because I read that in one of your books. In terms of your go-to grain, because I know this is something that interests a lot of people, millet versus quinoa, both seem to be okay based on what we're talking about?
No, millet and sorghum are perfectly safe. They're the only grains that don't have a hull. Most of the lectins are actually in the hull. Quinoa, you gotta pressure cook it. Otherwise, buckwheat, you gotta pressure cook. Sadly, you cannot pressure cook lectins out of wheat, rye, barley, or oats. Several of my patients have tried. Interestingly, I have a number of patients from Brazil, a Brazilian background, and a couple of the Brazilians, rice and beans is the classic food of Brazil, and they, to a person, said, we always pressure cook our beans. And this one guy who came to me with an autoimmune disease, his autoimmune disease started at age 12 when his mother exploded their pressure cooker and never used a pressure cooker again. And shortly thereafter that, he developed actually Crohn's disease because his mother exploded the pressure cooker. And it never dawned on him that that's the beginning of the end for him.
That's fascinating. So when you see patients who are chronically inflamed from, their microbiome being completely out of whack, what is typically the regimen that you put them on to kind of normalize them or get them back to balance?
Yeah, so I wish this had been my idea. Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, said all disease begins in the gut. And he didn't have the sophisticated tests that we have, but the guy was right. Interestingly enough, I have a fairly recent patient who's a Buddhist scholar, And, I gave him my pitch about Hippocrates, and the next time I saw him, he says, hey, I've been reading the ancient Sanskrit, I can read it, and did you know that the Buddha actually said that enlightenment begins in the intestines? And the Buddha and Hippocrates were contemporaries, the same time period. And so here's Western medicine and Eastern medicine, and it's going, holy cow, how'd these guys know that the intestines was, where everything was happening? But they actually did. So one of the things that I think has been critical for me is that, living in California with forest fires all the time, if you've got a leaky gut, if you've got widespread inflammation, trying to change people to an anti-inflammatory diet is really like fighting a forest fire with a garden hose. And I see so many people focused on anti-inflammatory foods rather than, look, here's the sort of foods that are going to cause leaky gut. And so my first rule is it's not what I tell you to eat that's important. It's what I tell you not to eat that's important. And once we stop, the continuous assault on the wall of the gut, then we can go on for bigger and better things. And the other thing that I think is important, I see so many people running out and getting gut microbiome tests. Number one, the gut microbiome changes on a daily basis based on the foods that you eat. So that's a snapshot of that day. Number two, yes, there are very beneficial bacteria, and yes, there are really nasty bacteria, gang members as I call them. But even if you've got leaky gut, if you've got spaces through your gut wall, then even beneficial bacteria, if they're getting across the wall of the gut, a bacteria is a bacteria once it's in you, and your immune system doesn't care. Oh, that's a good guy. I shouldn't be worried about him. So this focus on, what's my microbiome, like today, to me, really distracts us from what we should be looking at. And so I haven't gotten a gut microbiome on any of my patients in 25 years and probably won't.
Yeah, that's helpful actually to know, because a lot of whole health systems, as you mentioned, have really looked at the gut as the sort of root cause for disease. And I think even as Bobby and I like to discuss nutritional IQ, we really need to improve it, especially here in the West, because we've, went from this very processed food industry, and now I think the awareness is starting to grow with the increase in chronic disease. But I wanted to shift our attention a little bit more to your new book, Unlocking the Keto Code. And so start out by telling us what the premise of the book is.
Well, so the premise of the book is, believe it or not, I and almost everybody else got ketones all wrong as to what they do, why we ought to generate ketones from time to time, and why a traditional ketogenic diet, which was actually, the ketogenic diet was coined at the Mayo Clinic in 1930 as a treatment for childhood epilepsy. And that diet was an 80% fat diet, a 10% carbohydrate diet, and a 10% protein diet. And researchers found that these kids could get dramatic control of their seizures. And this was before the time of phenobarbital or Dilantin. And it was miraculous. The problem with a ketogenic diet of that nature, as any of us with kids and now grandchildren know, it's almost impossible to deny a kid carbohydrates. And as the Indian culture knows, it's almost impossible to deny adults carbohydrates. And as I talk about in the book, researchers from the University of Sydney in Australia have shown that there is a genetic drive in all animals to seek out carbohydrates, which is fascinating. So to deny, this basic genetic wiring is really hard. And that's why 60% of people who embark on a ketogenic diet quit within a month, because it's not a sustainable diet, number one. Number two, I've had a ketogenic diet version of my program for the last 20 years. And I actually, from day one, introduced people to medium chain triglycerides, MCT oil. And that was based, actually, going back to childhood epilepsy. Once drugs came out, the ketogenic diet for children went away. But these drugs have side effects, and many children with kids with seizure disorders have noted that their kids, they're not having as many seizures, but they're kind of dull. They're usually kept back in class because their brains aren't functioning properly. So in the 90s, there was a resurgence of interest in a ketogenic diet, but researchers found that if they gave kids MCT oil, they could produce the effects of a high-fat ketogenic diet, but give kids carbohydrates and proteins, and they'd still have seizure control using a MCT oil rather than a ketogenic diet. So then you go, well, that's fascinating. What's the deal with that? So the beauty of medium chain triglycerides are that they are absorbed, unlike any other fat, they are absorbed directly through the wall of the gut rather than traveling on chylomicrons. And they go directly to the liver via the portal vein, where they're converted into ketone bodies, ketones. And that's been shown to bypass this whole mischievousness of avoiding carbohydrates. So as I joke, you could have a big fresh fruit salad and have a tablespoon of MCT oil, and despite that huge carbohydrate load, you'd actually generate ketones. You'd have a level of ketones in your blood. And that's actually what I used in all my programs. And so when I was writing my last book, The Energy Paradox, and I was trying to explain what ketones do, how ketones work, and trying to explain, well, gosh, I don't use a low carbohydrate diet in my ketogenic diet, and yet it works really well. The lady I start the book with, Janet, she did great losing weight, getting rid of her pre-diabetes, changing her cholesterol numbers, but we kept adding carbohydrates to her diet to stop her from losing weight. So this whole picture of, well, wait a minute, how are ketones working? What are they really doing? Made me, unfortunately, dive into this deep rabbit hole that resulted in unlocking the keto code. And it turns out ketones are not some miraculous super fuel, but ketones are a miraculous signaling agent, and signaling agent of telling mitochondria what to do and how to protect themselves. And that's unlocking the keto code.
Yeah, Dr. Gundry, you talk a lot about the mitochondria in your book, and that seems to be an emerging area of science, even in the longevity space.
Oh, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about the mitochondria and why it's so important?
Yeah, I think, in the longevity paradox, I began to try to educate people about mitochondrial flexibility, metabolic flexibility. There's increasing evidence that most chronic disease processes, in at least part, occur because of damage to mitochondria or mitochondrial inflexibility. And that simply means that, and mitochondria are the little energy-producing organelles in most of our cells. They're sometimes called the power plant of the cell, and that's correctly deserved. Mitochondria take the food we eat and generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate, our energy currency. Making ATP is incredibly hard work, incredibly damaging to mitochondria. Oxygen, which goes into oxidative phosphorylation and making ATP, is incredibly damaging to mitochondria. You can't live with it, you can't live without it. We absolutely have to have oxygen to do this, but at the same time it damages the mitochondria. So there's very good evidence that cancer, your field of work, is a mitochondrial dysfunction disease. And I allude to that in the book. And I've got a wonderful success story about my very old Labradoodle Pearl, who was diagnosed with inoperable bladder cancer over a year and a half ago. And she couldn't pee, blocked her ureter. They wanted to do chemotherapy or put her to sleep. I said, gee, I treat cancer all the time in my clinic. I'll put her on my program. That was over a year and a half ago. Pearl goes on a 2-mile walk. She pees like a racehorse, and she takes a bunch of supplements twice a day that actually stop her mitochondrial dysfunction. So yeah, mitochondrial dysfunction probably underlies Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease certainly, absolutely underlies diabetes and prediabetes and insulin resistance. So focusing our attention on protecting our mitochondria really is one of the hallmarks of restorative medicine that I practice.
And when you talk about mitochondrial decoupling, can you explain that?
Yeah, this is so it's mitochondrial uncoupling. I know my wife always says decoupling just to drive me crazy. I did not coin that word. I wish I'd never heard that word, but it's in the scientific literature. And I spent about 6 months trying to figure out a better word to describe what uncoupling mitochondria is. But there's so many papers written about mitochondrial uncoupling, it turns out there's thousands, that I decided to use it and try to explain things. So let's use an example of a pressure cooker, since I've already mentioned it. Pressure cooker is really efficient at cooking food quickly, really efficient at destroying lectins. But high pressure is dangerous, and unless you have a pop-off valve in your pressure cooker to release some steam and pressure, that pressure cooker will explode. My mother exploded one. I remember it distinctly. It's food all over the ceiling. It was very exciting. So our mitochondria, again, really hard work, very damaging work, have to have a system of relieving the pressure to produce ATP. And they're controlled by pressure release valves. And these are emergency exits in the mitochondria. And they're controlled by uncoupling proteins. And these were discovered a number of years ago. There's 5 of them for every mitochondrial intermembrane. And they literally act as a pop-off valve. When things get too damaging in mitochondria, we release from the ATP electron transport chain protons from making ATP. And so you uncouple taking a proton and binding it with oxygen to produce ATP. That's where the word comes from. When I first did it, I joked, well, people understand uncoupling as breaking up a marriage or leaving a relationship. That is another form of uncoupling. But when you start looking at the science, lo and behold, at rest, 30% of all the calories entering a mitochondria to produce ATP is actually sent out. These emergency exits are uncoupled from making ATP. And you go, wow, that's really dumb. You mean I have to eat 30% more calories every day because of this throwing these calories out of the system. And then you start saying, well, maybe there's a reason for this. Well, number one, uncoupling mitochondria produces heat, and we're a warm-blooded animal. And so one of the things that we now know is that at baseline, we uncouple mitochondria to produce heat. You look at brown fat, and a lot of people now have heard about brown fat. Babies have a lot of brown fat. We know that adults who have a lot of brown fat are much healthier than adults who don't have much brown fat, and I go into that literature in the book. Brown fat is called brown because it's so densely packed with mitochondria that it looks brown under the microscope, as opposed to white fat, which is our storage fat. It doesn't have very many mitochondria, and it looks white under the microscope. Brown fat produces heat because brown fat, the mitochondria are profoundly uncoupled compared to other mitochondria. And so far down the line. Now, how does that relate to ketones? Well, we know that ketones make you lose weight if you go on a ketogenic diet. And people like myself and other keto experts have said, well, yeah, that's because you make your mitochondria efficient fat burners and you become an efficient fat burner and that's why you lose weight. Well, not so fast. Ketones originally were described in people who were starving. And yes, starvation is a really good way to produce ketones. So if you're starving, you would want to become an incredibly efficient fuel burner and get every last ounce of ATP out of every calorie you ate, because there isn't much. Imagine the shock when Professor Martin Brand in 2000 wrote a simple paper, and everybody ought to read it. It's easy read. Uncoupling to Survive. And it's in the book. There's a reference in the book. And Dr. Brand said, hey guys, guess what? If you're starving to death, the only thing that's important is the mitochondria has to survive at all costs. Because if the mitochondria dies, if the power plant's gone, that's it, you're done. And so the ketone should be signaling the mitochondria not to become super efficient, but to protect itself at all costs and to actually uncouple more. Uncouple, stop hurting yourself, and you go, but wait, that's so crazy. Well, he then went on to prove, and other people have proven this too, that not only are mitochondria instructed to waste fuel, but simultaneously make more mitochondria to carry the workload. And I think this is an important concept. So we could have a dog sled, and we could hook one dog up to the sled, and yeah, the dog could pull the sled. Wouldn't go very fast, wouldn't go very far before the dog got tired out. If we took 5 more dogs and added it to that one dog so that we now have a 6-dog sled, we're going to go a lot faster, we're going to go a lot farther, and each dog only has to do a 1/6 of the work of that one dog. The only downside is 6 dogs eat more food than one dog. So in this brilliant design, ketones tell each individual mitochondria, don't work so hard, but hey, because you have your own DNA and you can divide within a cell without the cell dividing, make 6 more of your cells to carry the workload, and each of you will not have to work as hard. And then you go, wow, that's pretty clever. So then Brand went on to publish papers. Guess what? Since you and I are interested in longevity, you look at super old people, 105 years old, who are thriving. They have the most uncoupled mitochondria compared to the rest of us mere mortals. And you go, what a survival advantage. You know, I want 6 dogs on my sled, and I don't want them to work very hard. And so when you start then looking at, okay, uncoupling seems to be a really interesting longevity trick. Are there other ways to get uncoupling done that mimic what ketones do? And the premise of the book is, surprise, there's all these great easy ways to mimic the signaling of ketones to tell mitochondria to uncouple. And the great news is you don't have to do an 80% unpalatable, boring diet. You can eat great food that are common in so many cultures and still get the power that ketones bring to uncoupling without the misery.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time. So one last concept. I know that you were one of the first people to even coin the word intermittent fasting. And I know that you're a believer in fasting. How often do you do it? And what does your typical diet consist of? What's your schedule and what do you eat?
Yeah, great question. Believe it or not, with my first book back in 2007, originally I had an entire chapter on intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating. And my editor at the time at Random House said, this is nuts. This is crazy. This book is crazy enough. You got enough kooky ideas in this book. We're not going to have this chapter. I said, no. You don't understand. You know, the literature is so dramatic in animal studies, and I personally, I'm now in my 23rd year, from January through June, I eat one meal a day. I eat all my whole meal in 2 hours from 5 to 7 o'clock at night, so that 22 out of 24 hours I'm fasting.
Wow.
Now I take the weekends off. I eat 2 meals on the weekend, but I've been doing this for 23 years. So she said, all right, I'll give you 2 pages to make your case. And anyone who doubts that I'm the first to write about this, look it up in the book. And it's funny, I was speaking at a symposium a couple of years ago, and I'm now with HarperCollins, but my editor from Random House was there, and she walked up to me and she said, I am so sorry. She said, you know, you are so ahead of your time in everything. I should have believed you about intermittent fasting. Can you ever forgive me? I said, yeah, it's okay. And, you know, people caught on. But the point of this book is, first of all, it's really, really hard to get someone who is metabolically inflexible, which 80 to 99% of Americans are metabolically inflexible. They have insulin resistance. They can't make a shift between burning fat and sugar. Trying to say, okay, I know you eat breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. Tomorrow you're going to have breakfast at noon. Good luck. Most people fall flat on their face because they can't make that shift, and they get headachy, and they get dizzy, and they lose energy. What I like to do is say, okay, I know you like to eat breakfast at 7 o'clock. Next week, Monday through Friday, let's have breakfast at 8 o'clock. That's all I'm asking. Come on, 1 hour. On the weekends, we'll take the weekend off. Okay, we've made it 1 week. Next week, come on, you made it to 8 o'clock. Let's go to 9 o'clock. And we'll eat at 9 o'clock the next week. And so forth. And we'll take the weekend off. So over 5 weeks, we hold people's hands in my clinic and in the book, and we take you to get to about a 12 o'clock eating. And the evidence is so overwhelming that if we can get people to get an eating window of about 6 to 8 hours in the day, it dramatically improves uncoupling of mitochondria, as I show in the book. It dramatically, in animal studies, extends lifespan, and if we take Dr. DeCappo's work from the NIH, it would extend our lifespan by 10 good years just by doing that. And in the Italian athlete study that I talk about, restricting Italian athletes to a 7-hour eating window versus a 12-hour eating window had dramatic weight loss implications and dramatically lowered insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, which is still our best marker for successful aging. And all just by compressing your eating window without restricting calories. I mean, how fun is that? And the book also gives lots of tricks. Okay, you can't make it to 11 o'clock? Fine. Have a nut bar. You won't break your fast. Have a piece of goat cheese. Great trick. You won't break your fast. Have a tablespoon of MCT. All sorts of tricks to get you there. So what do I do? So, for instance, yesterday I didn't have breakfast. I didn't have lunch. Last night for dinner, I was actually in Los Angeles doing some podcasts. I had a shaved artichoke and avocado salad with Parmesan cheese on it. And then I actually had some pressure-cooked risotto with porcini mushrooms, and I poured olive oil all over it. And that was my dinner last night. And so far today, it's approaching lunch hour. I didn't have breakfast, and I won't have lunch. And I'm not hungry.
Dr. Gundry, well, we won't have enough time to go further into the strategies, some of the easy strategies that you said that people can use to uncouple their mitochondria. So our listeners are going to have to read your book.
Got to get the book.
Yeah. Bobby and I have a copy, and it's fascinating. It's actually one of my favorites from the series. But before we go, we like to ask all of our guests on the podcast, you're busy, you're the living definition of longevity. You still run a full practice at your stage in your career, and you're running institutes and your own supplement line and, writing books and papers and doing all this research. What is your guilty pleasure? And also only eating, very time-restricted meals. So what is your guilty pleasure?
So I guess my guilty pleasure is going over to Italy and having their gelato. Believe it or not, Italian cows have what's called casein A2 rather than casein A1, which our cows have. And I have so many patients who swear they're lactose intolerant and can't have, ice cream here in the United States, but they go over to Italy, and to a person, they come back and say, did you know there's no lactose in Italian gelato? Because I can have Italian gelato and I'm fine. And I look at him and say, I got news for you. There's plenty of lactose in Italian gelato. It's still cow's milk. But you're having casein A2 cow's milk rather than casein A1. And I've been telling you all along, you're sensitive to the lectin-like compound casein A1. And they go, oh, I guess that proves it. And so, yeah, that's my guilty pleasure. And I'm actually, next week, our youngest daughter just turned 40, and we're taking her to Florence. And we'll stop off at the gelato place, I promise you.
That sounds perfect.
That sounds great.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gundry, for your time and knowledge and information. And we'll have to have you back to discuss just a full episode about mitochondrial uncoupling. Perfect.
It'd be fun to talk about because it's a weird word, but once you understand the implications in a daily life of uncoupling your mitochondria. And the reason I drink all these different teas is there, believe it or not, there's papers showing that every one of these different teas has a different effect on uncoupling my mitochondria. And, I want to be a super old 105-year-old with uncoupled mitochondria, so let's drink to that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gundry. This was a pleasure.
Nice to meet you both. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.